This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hi, I'm Blake Chastain, and this is Powers and Principalities. This show focuses on the systems and institutions that prop up white evangelical power and influence in America and the world. Season 1 is focused on white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. This is episode 7. My guest today is Bradley Onishi. Brad is an associate professor of religion at Skidmore College and co-host of the Straight White American Jesus podcast. And in this episode, we answer your questions about white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. We fielded questions from Facebook, Twitter, and email and answered them all on air. And let me tell you, you all had some great questions. I really enjoyed this conversation, and if you enjoyed this show, you'll definitely enjoy Straight White American Jesus, so be sure to check that out as well. You'll find links to that show in the show notes. If you'd like to support this show, please do so by telling people about it, leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, and by signing up for a subscription to my Substack newsletter, The Post-Evangelical Post, at postevangelicalpost.com. Listeners can get 25% off a paid subscription by visiting the link in the show notes. If I received around 800 subscribers, I could dedicate more time, even full time, to bringing you this content and expanding my coverage. You can follow me on Twitter at brchastain and on Instagram at brchastain_. Without further ado, let's get to this conversation. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Powers and Principalities. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Brad Onishi, who is one of the hosts of Straight White American Jesus and Associate Professor of Religion at Skidmore College. Brad, welcome to the show.
Blake, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and really excited to answer some of these questions sent in. They're great questions. So.
Yeah. So the focus of the show is actually going to be some audience questions. My producer, Jake Lewis, had this great idea of working into this season, actually having fielding some questions from the audience about different things that they might want to get answers for. And I immediately thought of you as a conversation partner in this because your show really covers a lot of the same ground as this one, which you've talked to a lot of the same people that I have. You have this academic training and these connections to these people that have been covering these things for years, and that's one of the focuses of this show is just sort of elevating these things that have been these criticisms and these points of view that have been there in academia for, in many cases, decades, but haven't made it to a broader audience. So I'm super excited to go through that. I actually have a couple of questions for you, just as a guest here for a minute before we dive into these audience questions. So
yeah, sure,
Brad, we are barreling toward the 2020 election. I mean, it's impossible to feel like we've got a grasp on this news cycle. Within the last week, Trump has contracted COVID. He left the hospital. All of these events that I can't even contextualize properly have happened. And it's all in the midst of this pandemic. Given the focus of both of our shows on things like white evangelicalism and its relationship to power and Christian nationalism, do you think that a broad understanding of these topics has improved at all since 2016?
Yes and no, I guess is maybe the answer. Yes, in the sense that we have so many resources by so many amazing folks. So obviously your work, Blake, Evangelical, and now Powers and Principalities has been a huge part of that. When 2016 happened, a lot of great minds decided they were going to dedicate their time and energy to figuring this out. So you've talked to Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead in their book, Taking America Back for God, right?
Yeah.
That's an incredible resource. Catherine Stewart wrote The Powers. That's an incredible resource. Sarah Posner wrote Unholy. That's an incredible resource. Ann Nelson wrote Shadow Network. David Gushee has a new book. And Robert Jones has there's a whole industry now to understanding these things. And I think the op-eds and the podcasts and the books are providing resources for folks that want to understand it, they can. So that's one.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I'll be honest, Blake, I've been pretty disappointed with, and I'm going to sound like some of the folks we cover here, so you're going to have to excuse me, but
that's okay.
I've been pretty frustrated with the mainstream media, and I as soon as I say that, I'm like, oh my God, I sound like I'm on Fox News or I'm in wherever. But here's what I mean by that is Trump refuses to guarantee a peaceful transfer of power, and as soon as the debate's over, George Stephanopoulos and Martha Raddatz are talking about how both guys were arguing. It was really kind of a gutter punch sort of brawl out there. Am I right? And I'm thinking the only headline here for the first however many segments should be that the sitting president has not guaranteed a peaceful transfer of power. It happened again last night. Mike Pence got asked the question. He did not answer it in a straightforward way.
Yep.
He dodged it. And again, it's a little bit of, well, who do you guys think won? Who won the debate? And I don't know what's going to happen in 20-something odd days, but I know that we will look back if Trump wins and Pence win and things continue to barrel down the path they're going. We will look back on nights like those and just shake our head. Like those are moments that we learned nothing from the 2016 Hillary Clinton, New York Times, FBI stories, all of the Clinton Foundation, whatever that was, all of the ways the media just tried to both sides it. We have sacrificed truth for balance. And I think there's a lot of folks out there that have done a lot of hard work to figure out how white evangelicalism, Christian nationalism, and the Trump presidency have all been bonded together. Unfortunately, many of our media outlets seem as gullible and ripe as ever for not understanding the moment we're in and what we're in for in terms of creeping fascism, authoritarianism, and Christian nationalism.
Right. Yeah. And you anticipated my other question, which was the way in which mainstream media has covered these things. And I feel similarly. It is surprising to see the same sort of missteps, the same sort of mistakes happening, and it's incredible that we've reached this point where there's still this particular blind spot, except for within these sort of wonky things like the things that you and I cover. And it's sort of wild to be in that place, because I'm just still sort of surprised that both the rhetorical strategies as well as the policy goals of people that are trying to enact Christian nationalist type goals, how that escapes notice. It's baffling to me.
Well, I mean, and like, so today we get the story that the FBI intercepted a group of men trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan, right? And
that's right.
What were they called when the headlines broke? They were called militia. What would happen if half a dozen Muslims or half a dozen people associated with Black Lives Matter tried to kidnap a governor? You know what we'd be talking about? You know what would be happening? Terrorism. It would be all on our news, in our feeds, our timelines. We'd be getting text messages. There'd probably be helicopters flying around both our houses right now, just because there'd be helicopters everywhere, because the country would be on full high alert. And yet half a dozen white dudes, part of the Liberate Michigan crew, are planning to kidnap and seemingly put on trial and execute the governor of Michigan. And they're just a militia.
Yeah.
That might be a minor example, Blake, and it may not be all that sort of big in the grand scheme of this. But to me, it's just one more example of how these things work. I'll give you another one. The other day, the Biden campaign, after Trump's COVID diagnosis and debacle and timeline lack of transparency, the Biden campaigns asked about his COVID test, and they gave some answers. And the headline in the New York Times is Biden campaign cagey about the VP's or the former VP's health. Are you serious? I mean, in a week where the president of the United States would not give a straight answer about when he got COVID, who he had infected, when he knew about it, how many people in the inner circle had been infected when they were going to public events. This is our headline from the paper of record. It's 2016 all over again. I mean, come on. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The fact that a militia we know to better classify as a Christian terrorist plot to kidnap an active governor of a United States state, to consider that a minor story, that just puts into perspective what we've become acclimated to in the last few years, which is just disheartening and sort of and troubling in a lot of ways. But it does indicate the ways in which white Christian privilege continues to manifest even in a society which is ostensibly post-Christian and all of those things. It still somehow makes its way into the editorial guidelines of major news outlets and things like that.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Well, we could commiserate about that all day long, but I think that we should start to work through some of these questions that we got from audience questions. I initially had put the call out a couple of weeks ago for there to be voice memos and things like that, but that didn't quite pan out. So we went ahead and extended the call to different parts of our social media platforms and things like that. So I've sent these to you in advance just so that we both have them. I'll go ahead and sort of acknowledge where they come from, but then we'll just use these as prompts and sort of talk through them. I've got a handful from the Evangelical Facebook group where I posted this. And the first one is, how does learned narcissism play a role for those who are part of a dominant subcultures? And how can advocates for change confront the narcissistic, quote, default way of thinking and viewing what's working or not working in our society? That's a pretty complex question for the first one, but let's give it a shot.
Okay. Yeah, there's no warm up. That's for sure. But I'll just jump in, Blake, quickly and say, as I was thinking about this question, I would say that there are certainly narcissists in our midst. I think that the president is a narcissist, and there are others we could point to. I also think, though, that focusing on the exceptionalism of the narcissist may give a little bit of a way out for everyone else in the group. And what I mean by that is, I think if we focus on the narcissist, what we don't see is that in the dominant subcultures, in the white Christian subculture of the United States, many folks are not narcissist. They're just privileged. They're incredibly privileged.
Yeah.
So are they just flaming out and out narcissists? I don't think so. But do they go to bed comfy in their privilege? And do they want to lose that privilege? No. Yes, there are narcissists leading the bunch, and we could point to some of them within the Christian world or within the evangelical world or whatever it may be. But I don't want us to take our eye off the rank and file folks who are simply enjoying privilege, don't want it to be upset, don't want to give it up, and see attacks on their faith or on their way of life as attacks on their faith and their way of life, rather than attacks on their privilege and the ways that they are leveraging it in society. So I'm not sure I would call that learned narcissism, but I don't know. I mean, what do you think? What do you take away from that?
I do think you're right in that the rank and file are hard to dismiss in that regard, and that does anticipate some of the additional questions that we have in the queue here. A degree of the narcissism, and I will say that since reading it, Kristen Kobus-Dumais, who I believe we've both spoken to and read her wonderful book, Jesus and John Wayne, it's just sort of staying present in my mind ever since having read it. And I do think that white evangelicalism and the sorts of political alliances that it's formed have crystallized that sort of narcissism. I'm like you. I can't necessarily dismiss the people who may not have a leadership position or may not think so highly of themselves, but still don't want to be made to feel even uncomfortable. Not even having their privilege really questioned, but just being made to feel uncomfortable. That's a broader discussion regarding white fragility and that sort of thing, especially for white people. But that is, I think, one thing, and one of the ways in which, despite conservative media's projection otherwise, it's sort of coddled the people that are the recipients of that media.
Yeah, yeah. I think that makes sense. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of narcissists in our midst and in that Christian cosmos that Kristen Kobes Dume explores in Jesus and John Wayne. I don't want to get us to the point where enjoying the comforts of being a man in a patriarchal society, or enjoying the comforts of being a white person in a white supremacist society, mean you're a narcissist. I think, and I say that not because I want to let people off the hook, but because I don't want to let them off the hook. Right. I want to show that there's a lot of ordinary, banal comfort and privilege that people enjoy that doesn't rise to the level of the raging narcissist like we see in someone like Donald. I mean, Donald Trump is a malignant narcissist. He has no shame. He has no ability for reflection, no ability for empathy. I just don't think 99% of people are like that. I do think 99% of people are very, very interested in protecting their comfort and their privilege, and as you're saying, don't want it disrupted. So anyway.
Yeah. The other question that this sort of dovetails into is one that says, also from the Facebook group, do you agree that white American boomer voters, even the nuns in this category, have a mild default tolerance, which is in question marks, toward Christian nationalism and their worldview? And this makes me think of Perry and Whitehead's useful sort of framework that they have of Christian nationalist ambassadors, accommodators, resistors, and rejectors. And this is what made me think of the accommodators. Does that resonate with you? What do you think about this question and that sort of ambivalence or tolerance for Christian nationalism?
Oh yeah, no, I'm exactly with you on that. I think anecdotally, I know a lot of white American boomers who don't go to church, they don't pray, they don't read the Bible. But you ask them about the good Lord and how he has blessed this country, and they're all about it. And that leads to that sort of feeds into how they vote and how they think about the country's narrative, the country's identity. And so they're very much accommodators. And it's another great example of how, according to Perry and White, Christian nationalism does not map on to religiosity. It doesn't mean you pray a lot, doesn't mean you read the Bible a lot, doesn't mean you go to church a lot. It means you take on this identity loosely. And so I think there's a lot. And so the question includes the nuns. And this is going to be a weird thing to say, but I think you can even be a person who says, I'm a nun. I don't necessarily identify as Christian. But all of the privileges of being a white boomer mean that you're benefiting pretty heavily from the white Christian nationalist framework, right? One of the ways I like to put it is white Christian nationalism is the no shoes, no shirt sign. If you are Christian and white, you can come in and shop anytime you want, and we might even give you the stuff. If you are Christian but not white, all right, that's good. We like that, right? We can work with that. That means you might be civil and docile in ways that will allow Christian nationalism to continue. If you are white but not Christian, you're still okay. And I think you actually might be better off in many cases than the Black or person of color who is a Christian. Because your whiteness is powerful in this country in terms of privilege. And so even if I'm a nun, I'm a boomer who's a nun, and I'm not necessarily committed to my atheism or my humanism or whatever it is it means for me to be a nun. I'm just somebody who doesn't really care about religion. I probably still love the 4th of July and Thanksgiving in ways that they feed into a certain story, a certain narrative. And whether or not that leads to excitement about Christian nationalism is one thing, but does it lead to indifference and complicity? For sure. For sure. And so, yes, there is a mild default is a great, whoever asked the question put it really well. Mild default.
Yeah.
That's a great question. If you're privileged, the default is great. Leave it as it is. Why are we going to mess up? Why are we going to mess with it? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I don't have any other additions to that. That was very well said. The other thing it made me think of is at least when in my sort of church history classes, for me, this sort of thing, and maybe this resonates with you in your past as an evangelical as well. These sorts of things were initially sort of represented as civil religion, and
Exactly.
at least for my professors, that was seen as like a lower form of faith. However, it is something that is privileged socially, which is very, very interesting, especially in the context of everything we've seen and witnessed and experienced since 2016 in particular.
Well, and think so. If we go back to the Black Christian or the Asian American Christian, right? I mean, let's just take the Black Christian. There are so many Black churches that, in my mind, rightfully so, are have very complicated relationships with holidays like 4th of July, right? Or there's a lot of Americans who may be Christian, but for whom Thanksgiving is not necessarily a holiday that they celebrate unabashedly because of the stories and events that are included in there. But American civil religion, the American idea of it being a chosen nation, an exceptional place, the high holy days of this nation, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Christmas. So if you're the person of color or if you're the Black or indigenous person and you think about Thanksgiving and the 4th of July, even if you're a Christian, those holidays might be really complicated for you.
Right.
And that means you might disrupt things. You might say things about those holidays that kind of disrupt the nice standard default of Americanism and Americana. If you're a white person and you're a boomer, you're 60 years old, you're 70 years old. I may be getting the boomer ages wrong there, but just hang with me. If you're a white boomer and you're not religious, you don't go to church, you don't read the Bible, you're somebody that you as a former evangelical in college and your church history professor looks down on as not a real person of faith. But look, you celebrate 4th of July. You love Thanksgiving. You're all about this. Guess what? You're not disrupting anything. You're not messing up the status quo. So you're easier to deal with for the white Christian nationalists, right? You're easier because you're less disruptive. You're more civil. I always tell people in my classes, like, civil religion is about being, you ever had to go to like an ex-boyfriend, an ex-girlfriend, or just an ex couple, and you have to tell them separately, like, hey, we're going to have dinner because it's Jennifer's birthday. Just be civil. Okay. Just be right.
Right. Yeah.
That's what civil religion is. Just be civil. Don't talk about genocide and Thanksgiving. Don't talk about how 4th of July doesn't include the Black slave. Okay? Just be civil. Let it go. Well, if you're a white person and you're not religious, you're likely to do that. If you're a Black person and you are religious, you're likely not to do that. So of course there's a mild default for the white boomer in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Very well said. And that was a very, very good question from the group. The next one moving on here is another good one here is that it seems like Christian nationalism has been building in evangelicalism for decades, since the 50s maybe, and evangelicals have made strong headway, particularly within this administration, the Trump administration. If Trump is defeated in November, where would evangelicals go from here? A lot of their younger members fled in droves, which is true. How would white evangelicalism reinvent itself to try to attract younger members? The final question here is white Christian nationalism even appealing to younger evangelicals? There was actually a piece that addressed that just today. The overall thrust of this question, which is very good, is what would evangelicals do if they face a political defeat in November?
So I don't think they need to reinvent themselves because, Blake, you talk a lot about this and Dan and I talk a lot about it. Evangelicals are the absolute maestros of being simultaneously in power and martyrs.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah. So look, I think we saw it last night. Mike Pence is on the stage. He's giving his very calm mansplaining sort of answers, talking over both the moderator and Senator Harris.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to go right back to who they were when Barack Obama was president, agitating, whining, complaining because they're the martyrs who are being attacked and their culture and their faith is being, in their minds, put out of the public square. This is a play. They're actually more comfortable as the opposition than they are being in power, because the whole thing is built on martyrdom. The whole thing is built on, you're taking away what I take to be the heart of my country's faith and culture. So I'm going to get out here and tea party it up. I'm going to get out here and talk about how you're destroying faith in public schools. I'm going to get out here and say, trans bathroom bills are destroying the country, blah, 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 blah. They have this. They're good. They don't need to reinvent any of that. I do not think white are attracting younger people. I do not think that younger people in the evangelical church are going to become more liberal and stay. Blake, I would love your opinion on this. My take is this. When we were 20, there was always somebody saying, hey, new generation of evangelicals, Brian McLaren, someone else, we're gonna do this different. Social justice, more compassion, more inclusion, we're gonna do it. And you know what ends up happening every time that younger generation tries that? They get excised from the movement. They're not allowed. They're not allowed to stay.
Absolutely.
I mean, is that gonna change, Blake? I mean, do you think that there's anything different now?
I don't really see that as a possibility. I think that the structure of white evangelicalism has gotten further and further constrictive over time. And there's just so many examples, even from the last few years. You look at evangelical organizations like the InterVarsity Press, who around 2014 forced anyone who was either themselves queer or affirming of LGBTQ plus Christians to leave the organization because they had to sign a statement of faith. You see the ways in which, going back to the 80s, the conservative resurgence of the Southern Baptist Convention, like all of these things over time, the accepted level of orthodoxy has gotten smaller and smaller. And I do see them being successful in creating people to continue to carry their banner. And I also worry about their ability to maintain minority rule through all manner of legislative shenanigans. I mean, from installing Amy Coney Barrett and completely disregarding all of the supposed precedent that they set with blocking Merrick Garland and all of the comments that they said in regards to that. Lindsey Graham doesn't care at all. Not that he's like distinctly evangelical, but he is within the GOP establishment. It's hard for me to see them really changing their tactics because they so far have been successful. And I guess I've gone down the rabbit hole in regards to this, as I'm sure you sort of feel this way too, of just being further convinced of the exchange that they've made from the tenets of their faith for grasping at power.
Yeah.
I don't see that changing. I see them continuing to appeal to a certain type of person who is white or male or has been convinced that is the particular God-given, world order, that white men should be at the top, and white Christian men in particular. It's hard for me to be optimistic about this because they don't want to be reformed. They've just proven that time and again, and that is part of what interests me as a podcaster. Is why,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and they leave destruction in their wake. But as long as they maintain power, that continues to be the important thing.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. I agree. And the demographic will continue to get smaller. And I think as the demographic gets smaller, the shenanigans will continue to rise. I mean, we saw today Mike Lee, senator from Utah, tweeting that democracy is not necessarily the best thing for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that was a preamble to, as numbers get smaller and our majorities are less and less tenable, we will resort to advocating for authoritarianism, for fascism, for whatever we need to, because
Mm-hmm.
the goal is not anything but to retain power. I think we've both said that, and I think we both have discovered that in our various rabbit hole, studies and explorations. And to me, that's how it works here. And democracy is not something that they prize. It's power. So.
Right. It's troubling, and I wish I could be more optimistic about it, but that's sort of where I am a few weeks out from this election.
Yeah.
Another question actually comes from someone who doesn't live in the U.S. and sort of is looking at this manifestation from an outside perspective. That's what's informing this question, which is the American white Christianity really about Christianity, or is it merely a kind of national religion or cult which becomes more and more distant from all other Christianities? This person sees it as highly disturbing. When they first saw a Bible that had things like stars and stripes, they were super confused. Again, they continue and say, how do you stop something like that? So as viewing this from an external foreign perspective, or even as someone who is outside of Christianity here in America, how would you explain these phenomena to people outside of it?
I first started to understand this when I moved to the UK in my early to mid 20s. And that's really when I started to deconstruct. And it really struck me there how much the language of faith and the language of God, the language of one nation under God is to our country's fabric and our DNA. It also struck me how privileged white Christians are here. And so, yes, I mean, the short answer is white Christianity in this country is imbricated in nationalism. It is. That goes for white Catholics. It goes for white mainline Protestants. Across the board, they are more likely to vote in certain ways when it comes to immigration, have certain ideas about race, have certain ideas about refugees, and so on and so forth. So I think it is there. There's no denying that from afar, we have a country that is supposed to be one of the foremost secular democracies in the world, and yet the national identity is tied up strictly with Christianity. I mean, you, Blake, about civil religion. We certainly have a civil religion in this country, right? If you are not a monotheist who celebrates certain holidays in certain ways, if you don't pray, if you don't acknowledge one nation under God, if you don't participate in those ceremonies and rituals, whether that is the 4th of July or Thanksgiving, whether that is the way that you think about how we should start a high school football game, the ways that you think that our president should be a person of faith. I mean, in one sense, I'm really glad that Biden has pushed so hard against this idea that the Republicans are the only party of faith.
Yeah.
On the other hand, right, there's a danger that, I mean, the DNC was almost Christian. I mean, Biden was talking about his Catholicism, Senator Coons, Cory Booker. Don't get me wrong. I think that reclaiming the mantle of faith from the Republicans is something that's important, but it speaks to that religion is so built into our culture. I mean, if Bernie Sanders were the nominee, do you know what we would be hearing right now? 24/7. Atheist Marxism, communism trying to destroy your life. And we have it with Joe Biden, and the guy goes to mass every Sunday. What would it be like if an atheist Jew was the nominee for the DNC? So anyway, in answer to this question, I think the short answer is yes. If I may, Blake, I'll give you one answer and then I'll shut up, I promise. I grew up in Southern California in what was ostensibly church. Quakers are not supposed to be nationalistic. We're supposed to be the last thing you would ever think about being nationalistic. In the after World War I, the 19 teens, the church that I eventually became part of, somebody brought in an American flag to the sanctuary. Mm-hmm. And one of the elders stood up, threw the flag outside on the ground and said, "We do not mix the flags of the nation with the worship of our God." Mm-hmm. Fast forward 100 years later, and about a year ago, somebody relayed to me that at my old church, the guy who had been there since the church, since he was a kid, he'd been there 50, 60 years. The guy that fixes the bus when it breaks down for the church, runs the soundboard, always working behind the scenes to make things go, that kind of guy, right?
Right.
Of church. He never went back. The guy had been at that church 60 years. Is this? It wasn't always like it is now. That there were ways that some of this was a little more separate, and there was a little bit more consciousness of the separation of the flag and the Bible. That is just not true anymore. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's a powerful anecdote, and it's emblematic of many people's relationship to faith and patriotism here in the United States. I want to close out the section from the Facebook group, with one that I think really gets to the point. They ask, can Christian nationalism really be separated from white evangelicalism? Or is it really the marrow of white evangelicalism?
So I'm going to go back to an interview I did with Randall Balmer for our series, Wave. We did a series, The Orange Wave, A History of the Christian Right, since 1960. And our first interview was with Randall Balmer, who's a professor at Dartmouth. He himself is an evangelical. He's in his 70s. And one of the things that if you read Randall Balmer, if you listen to the interview I did with him, he does a great job of showing you that Christian nationalism was not always synonymous with white evangelicalism. That if you go to the 19th century, there were white evangelicals who were reform-minded. Some of them we might even call fighting for women's suffrage, fighting for abolition, fighting for a more inclusive and equal society. Did they still experience a white Christian privilege in this country? Sure. But was their ethos about nationalism and power? Not necessarily. It was, in some sense, some very strong sense, fighting for the marginalized. And that continued. You know, one of the things Randall Balmer and I talked about in that interview is Jimmy Carter just turned 96. Jimmy Carter's an evangelical. He's 96 years old. He's from Georgia. He's a Southern Baptist. And when he was president, he appointed of color and more people of color and more women to the federal bench than anyone before him. He was a champion for so many causes related to women's rights and others. Jimmy Carter is what evangelicalism could have been, right?
Yeah.
And yet it has fused with nationalism. And Randall Balmer said, and this is not me, Randall Balmer says at the end of that interview, a guy who's been an evangelical his whole life still maintains that identity. He says, I don't think there's anywhere to go from here. After the 2016 election, I think we have to admit to start over because there's no separating Christian nationalism from evangelicalism at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a difficult thing. I mean, people wrap their entire identities around their faith, and that becomes painful when it's a sense of betrayal over this sort of thing. And I think at this point, it is really hard for me. And even like engaging with ideas like those that have been put forth by Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry in their book about Christian nationalism, they're sociologists, and so they distinguish between Christian nationalism and white evangelicalism because definitions are super important in that field. And you have to be precise with your words and what you're trying to study. It's hard, like with white evangelicalism, I think it's one of the reasons why mainstream media falls down in its coverage of it and its understanding of it, is that it tries, and many of the leaders encourage this sort of obfuscation and like trying to make it vague and not monolithic, and all of those things can be true, but a lot of the things that have become common are things like the consumer culture, like a lot of the theological beliefs around complementarianism related to gender, and the unexamined history of white supremacy and evangelicalism. All of these things, it takes a lot of work, and if you use a cultural lens like Kristen Kobus-Dumay does and says this is a white evangelicalism, you get one result. If you use a theological lens like the Bebington Quadrilateral, you're going to get a different result when you talk about white evangelicalism. The Bebington Quadrilateral is like evangelicalism is defined by its relation to what? Biblicism, crucicentrism, conversionism, and a fourth one that I can't remember right now.
Is it end times? Is that the fourth one?
But nonetheless, like you're going to get a different result. But within the lived reality of people in the United States in particular, it's really hard to find an evangelicalism that is not related in some way to Christian nationalism. There are groups that are trying to move that needle. Vote Common Good is one example of someone working, of a group working within evangelicalism in order to move people to more progressive political causes. But damn, do they have their work cut out for them.
Yep.
That to me is, it's a difficult thing to separate. And I think it's got far more of the marrow than they think. And that's just it's what I would appreciate even from evangelicals who still live in it is just some honesty around that at this stage.
Yep.
So
I agree.
we have some other questions that we fielded from Twitter. One is from Cheerful Nerd on Twitter, which was, what's the best way to get around the mental wall people have that won't allow them to process any info that contradicts their Christian nationalist worldview? Wow, that's a really good question to fit into 280 characters.
I get asked something like this question a lot, and so I'm probably going to throw it to you, Blake, sooner than later. I guess I can tell you what will not work, and what will not work, because I have done this many times to my chagrin, is engaging them on Facebook, posting articles, posting facts, posting data, trying to win a battle on social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, wherever you do that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that's not going to work. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not openings for dialogue, but those openings are not going to come through a certain just head-to-head intellectual battle. You know, one of the things I talk to my students a lot about is logos, pathos, ethos.
Yeah.
Logos is logic and it sort of more intellectual sort of coherency. Pathos is, of course, more emotional. And the way I've started to think about this, Blake, and I'm curious if you have maybe just a better understanding of this than I do, is I've really got to rely on pathos. So when I'm with family members and friends who seem to be in this space, my strategy now is wait for a moment of reflection and a moment where they're feeling something. So one example is when Trump held up the Bible in the photo op, I had some family and friends who are that was the first time that they signaled in subtle ways that they were a little bit dismayed. And that was a moment where I could ask a little bit. So how did that make you feel? Like, why does that upset you? You know, why is that not something that you approve of? And once we get into that sort of space, then maybe I can start with my facts or my data or my whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to lead. I'm not going to lead with that. I got to wait for that emotional opening and then go. And you might be saying, well, how do I get them emotional opening part? And I'm not really sure. I think those things can come in various places and through various forms. But what I do know is frontal logos logic attack is not going to get you anywhere anyway. That may not be a very good answer, Blake. You might have.
No, I think you actually, I think that can often be the best sort of tactic to take. You know, I'm going to fall back on a cliche, but you know, a lot of evangelicalism is, and the things that it sort of teaches us is about things like relationships. A lot of that is predicated on an individual relationship, whether that's a familial relationship or you're friends with this person. A lot of times you're not going to convince them, you're not going to begin to get them to start to think about things unless you have that sort of personal connection. David Dark on Twitter, he put it very succinctly once. He said, "Who gave you permission to think?" Like he was asking people to say, respond to him and say like which people in your life, which authors, that sort of thing. And I'll share my own sort of personal anecdote. I was in grad school. I took this class called Moral Reform in America, and I didn't know at the time, but it played this huge role in sort of my being able to dismantle some of the cultural things that I had been taught at my Christian college. This was in grad school. At my Christian college, and just sort of within the milieu of evangelicalism. And one of the books that was assigned was this book called Why Marriage by George Chauncey. And this was prior to marriage equality. George Chauncey is a professor, I believe, at the University of Chicago, who's gay. And it was this really sort of very pathos oriented discussion about why marriage equality was important to the LGBTQ community. And I already had begun this process of wrestling with the clobber verses that evangelicals like to trot out when they disapprove or condemn queer people. But it was reading that book and sort of the way in which it connected with me, and the way when I came out of reading that book, it was like, how would it feel if I was in that position and say, as a straight person, you've never questioned the fact that you're straight? Why would you ever question your urges or your attractions? But queer people are forced to do that by society. And to me, that as a person that's a white man, that like there are a number of different privileges that I don't have to examine because I'm not forced to by society. And I think one of the things, going back to Christian nationalist privilege and things like that, is sometimes you just have to be jolted. And a lot of times that doesn't happen until you reach them. And that's not fair. That's not right. But it is sort of reality.
Yeah. No, and I guess one of the frustrating things is we never know when that jolt will come.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think it's also easy to feel like we live in such a polarized political environment that often many of us feel like we have the responsibility to speak up at family dinner or wherever it is when people are saying things that are hurtful or violent against communities, people of color, LGBT community, whoever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think speaking up in order to make sure that those comments don't go unchallenged is one thing, but thinking that they're going to lead to the kinds of getting around the mental wall, as the question put it, I don't think that's when it happens.
Right.
I think that's hard. That's a hard lesson to learn, is that if somebody says something offensive about a minority group or a marginalized group, and you call them on it, that's great. And don't get me wrong, you should do that. Okay, I'm not downgrading that. I'm saying, don't think that that's the moment when you're going to find a way around the wall, because it's probably not. It's probably when they're going to put up every defense they have.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And it's not something that you're not responsible for the pace of someone else's growth.
Yep.
At the same time, the other thing, like, you absolutely have every right to your own sense of boundaries and everything else. So if it's no longer viable for you to be in a relationship with that person, then absolutely set that boundary, or say, this is off the table if you want to maintain a relationship with me, or this is table stakes in order to be in a relationship with me. Like, all those things, it's a complicated question when it comes to interpersonal relationships, but I totally agree with you. It's not something that is always going to be, you're not going to see it right away. But going back to, religious language, maybe you're planting a seed that someone else,
that's right.
someone else will reap,
I think that's a really good way to put it. Yeah.
One of the other quick questions was from the real Samo on Twitter was, what are your thoughts on the religious revival being led by Sean Fucht, a controversial figure who keeps popping up in these supposed counter protests at Black Lives Matter events and things like that?
I would ask folks to go read a great article. I'm not sure if you've read this one, Blake, by D.L. Mayfield at Religion News Service. And in that article, Mayfield talks about how the day I realized I was no longer an evangelical was at one of the rallies led by Sean Fucht. And Mayfield goes through this great narration of how Sean Fucht shows up in Portland, starts doing what Sean Fucht does, which is leading a massive singing rally. They're singing worship songs in places where there have been protests, where there have been, where there have been uprisings.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that Mayfield puts it is, I knew all the songs, but I couldn't sing because it became so apparent to me in that moment that what was happening is Sean Fucht and his people were showing up to places where there was hurt, where there was vulnerability, where there was pain. And instead of listening to the shouts and the cries of people of color, of marginalized groups, of those who had been brutalized or hurt, those that were asking for change, instead of listening, they were singing over them. They had no interest in what they had to say, no interest in forming, as you said, Blake, that evangelical word of a relationship, no interest in empathizing with their situation so they might come to understand it a little bit better. The goal was, we're going to and sing over you. And I think Fucht is pretty opportunistic in this sense. I think that it's a way to, it's a classic evangelical move to say, we're going to rally to help bring the nation back to God and instill healing. And in reality, what you're doing is just talking over everybody. It's not that different from Mike Pence on the debate stage, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good analogy. The inherent disrespect is palpable. I don't really have anything nice to say about any of this. So, I mean, it is, again, as you said, very opportunistic. It's for the Facebook likes. It's damaging. It's reckless in the face of the pandemic. It's all shenanigans.
Well, but if we go back to that question about younger evangelicals, right?
Right.
Somebody might say, "Oh, isn't Sean Fucht one of those leaders who's going to bring in the young evangelicals?" And my response would be, Sean Fucht is a younger version of Mike Pence in the sense that he has long hair. He looks like a kind of surfer hippie guy, very attractive with his guitar, charismatic, and yet when you get below the surface, there's nothing different there. I mean, Blake, when I was an evangelical back, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I think of all the times people showed me young hip leaders with skinny jeans and a goatee, and they were like, they're going to change everything. They're different. And they weren't. They were not. There was a different sheen,
Mm-hmm.
a different costume, but it was this. I mean, Sean Fucht is showing up to sing over people. He's showing up to silence people, not to listen. I just see that as very similar to what happens in white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism all over the country all the time. So you're right. I'm not being nice. I should probably just stop. But anyway, that's my, so.
All right. We've got a few more to round things out. Another one from Twitter is from Wentling Jeff. Despite being an XV, which is short for evangelical, still deconstructing, I'm still stunned by white nationalists' disregard and disdain for Jesus' basic teachings on humility, meekness, and charity. They've listened to our podcasts in regards to Jesus and John Wayne. Is it really just toxic masculinity that accounts for this dismissal of Jesus' teachings?
So, as a scholar, I never want to ever offer an explanation to say it's just one thing, right? It's just this, because I always feel like it's a little bit reductive. Now, that's not to say that toxic masculinity is not a huge part of that. The way I would put it, though, is that toxic masculinity is one vector for Christian nationalism. And there's other vectors, but all of those vectors share an underlying desire for power and domination. So, yes, I agree with you, Jeff, who asked the question. The disregard for Jesus' basic teaching on humility, meekness, and charity is always jarring. I mean, I just read Matthew 5-7 with my students. Most of them had never read the Bible ever. And their comments were like, Professor Onishi, I know a lot of Christians. They don't seem to share the values I found in Matthew 5-7.
Which is not too different from Gandhi's famous reaction.
That's exactly what I told him. And I guess my response to Jeff here is, it is stunning. It is jarring. It never gets any less jarring. And yet you can understand this as toxic masculinity is a vector, white supremacy is, American nationalism is a vector. What is the common denominator buttressing all of those? Domination and power. That is what we want. It is not about Jesus' teaching. It is not about compassion. It is not about anything else except for domination and power. And so that leads to a multifaceted analysis of toxic masculinity, white supremacy, nationalism, so on and so forth, as the ways that it's deployed. So anyway, I think that's what I would say in response to that. It's not just masculinity. It's a lot of things, but those things do share a common foundation.
Yeah. Yes, it's a yes and sort of thing.
Yep.
And with toxic masculinity, as with so many other elements of white evangelicalism more broadly, it's not contained within one particular manifestation. As you said, the vector is a very good metaphor for it. That push towards power, that goes way deep in America, and the sorts of like the early understandings of the world that the initial colonialists had when they came to this land and began imposing themselves on the indigenous people, and everything that's happened since then. And a lot of it can be traced maybe to, say, like the Great Chain of Being philosophy in Europe, and the ways in which within the Great Chain of Being, it would say that royalty is just below angels, and below royalty are regular people. And then as time goes on, it gets exceedingly racist. And then there's also other, layers of animals and how they relate within the Great Chain of Being, and this hierarchical view of the world. It manifests, but it's all gotten super complicated and twisted in on itself here. Within our time here on Earth, and the end result is not pretty.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the idea of hierarchy is important here. And if there's anything that white nationalists, if there's anything that Christian nationalists, if there's anything that misogynists love, even if they won't admit it, it's hierarchy. They want to be at the top of a hierarchy, and that they feel that's their right and their privilege, and they don't want to give that up. And so they will use the mantle of Christianity, humility, meekness, and charity, in order to get that power and retain it. That to me is the easiest way to understand this.
Yeah. Well, we've got, I think, one final question, unless you have any other ones, and it's a two-parter. And I think the final question might be a really good one to sort of go out on here. The first part of this question is, I'm really struggling with. This is from Jeff via email. Another Jeff. I'm really struggling with how the Christian nationalist value system has impacted our understanding of justice, and how it's currently empowering the Blue Lives Matter movement. The second question is, maybe it's just me being hopeful, but it feels like the Christian nationalist worldview is generational. Is this going to die out in a decade or two? So let's take that first part first and talk about how Christian nationalist values enable things like the Blue Lives Matter movement.
Well, okay. So one of the verses, or the themes that gets thrown around a lot, is Romans 13, which is abide by the law. Robert Jeffress said last week that disobeying or running from the police is akin to disobeying or running from God. Okay. Why? Why would you have that kind of view of the world? And it's everything we just talked about with the previous question. Is if you understand yourself to be the rightful pinnacle of a social, cultural, racial, religious hierarchy, if to be a white, straight Christian who abides by a patriarchal system, what you want, and if that is what this country has had for how many years, we could go back to 1776, but we should probably go back to 1619. If that is what we have had for that long, then your side, your way of maintaining it is going to be those who can enforce power and enforce the boundaries. Well, that happens to be in this country, the police. And so to me, it makes perfect sense that if you're a white, straight Christian nationalist who abides by a patriarchy, and you are hearkening back to a landowning gentry in the antebellum agrarian society called the United States, then of course you're with Blue Lives Matter, because they're the ones that are going to enforce and protect your place at the pinnacle of that hierarchy. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if people sort of can see it through that lens, but to me, there's a very clear relationship. And then going back even further, something my co-host Dan says a lot is, since Constantine, unfortunately, most of, not all, not by any means any reductive thing here, but a predominant form of Christianity has been on the side of empire.
Mm-hmm.
It's been on the side of empire. If you think of the United States, unfortunately, as a crumbling empire, it makes sense that those who are trying to hold on to power would be with the enforcers, and they would side with them. And so, anyway, I think that makes sense. I think there's no surprise there for me, and there's a direct correlation between Christian nationalism and Blue Lives Matter. It's a pretty intimate thing.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add to that. I think that is very well said. What about this second part in regards to this being generational and whether something like Christian nationalism could actually die out as a sort of ideology?
I think we really need to be careful. I think every generation in this country has thought that might be a possibility. So if I go back to the election of Barack Obama, okay, I've told the story on our podcast before, Blake, but the election night of Barack Obama, very weird and circumstances. I was on a first date while watching the election night, which was it was just a great episode of the foolishness that is me oftentimes. And so Barack Obama gets elected, he comes out on stage, and I cannot keep it together. I mean, I am weeping through my face. I mean, when you weep, it's not just from your eyes, it's like your nose and your mouth and your ears ostensibly are just all crying at the same time. Well, that's what I was doing, right? Why? Because it felt like we had broke through to something that was unimaginable. We broke through to a place where this biracial man with an immigrant father walks out on stage in Chicago, near your home, Blake, with his black wife and his black children.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who thought this was possible?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, where are we going to head in my lifetime when it comes to this country and its leadership, this country and its ethos, this country and its culture? And what happens? Soon thereafter, we have the Tea Party. Soon thereafter, we have Donald Trump. And so for me to sit here and say that there's any chance of this dying out would seem irresponsible. It might. We might see in Kamala Harris, a biracial woman, early interfaith family, the future of America. But you know what? We've been saying that for how long? Looking at young people of color, young queer people, young non-Christian people, young atheists, nuns, secular, whoever it is, we've been saying, you're the future of America. And they are. I'm not saying they're not. All of those folks are the future of this country. And yet, here we are with Donald Trump as president, and we all had to watch Mike Pence on the stage last night. That is not going away. It's not a matter of fate or destiny. It's a matter of action and organization.
Yeah.
The only way it's going to die out is organization and action. There are more of us than them, period. But it's not going to happen because it's destined to. It's going to happen because we fight tooth and nail to make it happen.
Coming from being a white man here in America, it's hard to be completely optimistic without being informed by the last several years. And you're right. Like it didn't begin just with the election of Trump. It goes back to like McConnell turning the Republican Party into the party of no, and successfully doing that. And by them being able to work so successfully in activating and enraging white grievance. And there's a lot of soul searching that just a lot of people need in order for white America to participate in the future of America. They need to be able to look at American history, look at the present of America, and be able to see themselves racially in the way that everyone else that isn't white or hasn't been made white has been seen. and to reckon with that. Like, we see glimpses of it, glimpses of that capacity. But when one of our two major parties is not interested in encouraging the better angels of our nature, and are much rather oriented towards keeping people angry over things rooted in racism and Christian nationalism, it's hard to believe that it will just disappear, because these things are so entrenched in not just our politics, but also in our religion. And I'm encouraged by books like White Too Long that dive into this. But nonetheless, there's a lot of work ahead of us. And as people like myself who are white and need to reckon with this personally and socially, as well as just not standing in the way of other people achieving equality here in the United States. Such a powerful question to sort of to end things on, and I know you're also running out of time here. Brad, I want to thank you so much for talking through these things with me, and sharing your thoughts on these very good questions about Christian nationalism and this moment here in America. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find your podcast and anything else you might be involved in?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me, Blake. And just looking at the folks who've been on Powers and Principalities, I feel just incredibly honored and flattered to even just be here with you. So thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for the questions. I mean, incredible, important questions, not ones that have probably definitive answers, but really appreciate the chance to discuss all of this. So you can find me at Bradley Onishi on Twitter. My podcast is Straight White American Jesus. And, we record a weekly roundup on Fridays, and we do interviews and other series usually on Tuesdays. And kind of excited to announce we're just rolling out our website. So straightwhiteamericanjesus.com is up and running, and you can go there and find our show, find blog posts, find transcripts, information of the folks we've interviewed, all kinds of stuff like that. So check that out. And anyway, thanks, Blake, for having me. And I really hope we can partner as soon as and as often as possible.
Excellent. Brad, thank you so much. And everybody who is listening, please go check out and subscribe to Straight White American Jesus. If you have enjoyed this show, it's going to be right up your alley, because they've talked to many of the same people and also incorporate, as Brad mentioned, a lot of more direct news discussions and things like that. It is a wonderful resource. Please check it out. Brad, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you, Blake. Thanks for having me.
That'll do it for this week's episode. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. The theme music is by Dave Lefevre and Jake Lewis. A special thank you also again to Jake Lewis for recommending the very idea of this podcast, this particular episode. And it was just wonderful and a great opportunity to have this discussion with someone like Brad. If you enjoyed this conversation, please rate and review Powers and Principalities on Apple Podcasts and let others know about the show. You can also support the show via that subscription to the Post-Evangelical Post over at postevangelicalpost.com. All right. Talk to you soon.